Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this NRCoP National Hybrid webinar on the hidden signals, enhancing regulatory oversight through near-miss reporting. My name's Alice Turnbull and I'm a director here at NOPSEMA. I'm the Director of Exploration and Development Environment, and I will be facilitating today's event. We're coming to you live today from the beautiful Noongar country here in Western Australia in Perth. And on behalf of myself and Jodi Goodall, I would like to begin today by paying my respects and our respects to the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are physically gathered here today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging on all of the lands across Australia that people are joining us from today, and further extend my respects and acknowledge Māori as the Tangata Whenua and Treaty Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and pay my respect to any Māori who are present today as well. So we have a room full of engaged and enthusiastic regulators here today, keen to hear from our speaker. And we also have an online audience of about 250 people joining us from across Australia and New Zealand. Before I introduce our speaker, just a few points about NRCoP webinars. All of the webinars are recorded and will be made available on the NZOG YouTube channel. They're a great resource for regulators. We will be using the Q&A function in Zoom for questions, so I encourage you to put your questions in the Zoom facility there, and we will be allowing a good chunk of time for questions at the end. If you like the look of someone else's question, you're welcome to upvote it, and I will be prioritising questions that have are the most popular. I thought we got away from popularity contests, but in questions, no. We will attempt to get to as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A section. We will also ask our presenter to respond in writing to any questions that we can't get to that are particularly pertinent. And that resource will be added to the webinar recording once it's available on the NRCoP website. If the Zoom does cut out today, please stay with us on the webinar. The NRCoP team will be working frantically in the background to rectify the issue and get the live stream back up and running ASAP. If your internet connectivity drops out, we suggest restarting your connection and rejoining the Zoom webinar. But hopefully everything will run smoothly. So today in this session, we're going to be talking about the hidden signals, enhancing regulatory oversight through near-miss reporting. I first met Jodi about a year ago now at the National NRCoP Conference, where Jodi spoke about adapting the near-miss framework for your regulatory agency. And I'm really excited to have her here today to expand on that presentation and tackle the issue from a regulator's perspective. Exploring the challenges that regulators face when we collect or use near-miss data, trying to balance this tension about making it safe and encouraging people to report to us, but also still retaining our independence and having the ability to take appropriate action when someone reports an incident to us that requires us to take regulatory action. We'll also talk about collecting data in a way that we can effectively use it, avoiding pitfalls around guilty knowledge, making sure we've got the right data, making sure we understand why we're collecting it and what we're doing with it. We've got so much to go through, so before I get started, please let me introduce Jodi Goodall. Jodi is currently the Head of Organisational Reliability at Brady Hayward Australia. She works with business and government in high hazard sectors, helping to transform organisations to better prevent major accidents. Her operational experience of over 20 years spans mining, defence, explosives, heavy maintenance and logistics. Jodi's highly practical approach is based on systems thinking, data intelligence and the practices found in high reliability organisations. So it's my absolute pleasure, Jodi, to hand over to you.
Thanks, Alice. Appreciate that. I'm going to stand up. I hope that's okay for everybody in the back. Thank you, David and Alice from the WA chapter for having me here today. Welcome everybody online, and thank you to Lorraine and Shannon for for I suppose getting me to come along today. Appreciate it. Okay, we are talking about one of my favourite topics and something I'm super passionate about, which is how do we prevent fatalities and major accidents, and that is pretty much what I have dedicated my career to now. I was originally in normal safety, I would say, and I've worked out that it's certainly not where it's at, and really not where risk-based regulators should be at either. So we're going to talk today about the things that don't happen very often, but it absolutely should be front of mind for us as regulators and our industries. So this presentation is all about near-miss reporting. We're going to talk about the value of it, like why it is important and what you can do with it as regulators, and how it can really help you and help your industries prevent fatalities and major accidents. Serious harm, which is really the guts of why we need to do near-miss reporting. It's different in every industry. So whether you're in public safety, or you're in logistics with dangerous goods, and this might be a familiar scene. Is anyone familiar to anyone in the audience? That's a truck carrying ammonium nitrate from 2022 in the WA outback. The Montara spill, whether you're dealing with loss of containment and serious harm that comes out of oil and gas, or even not in the high hazard industries, but things like robo-debt and business crisis. All of these events, they don't happen very often, but we need to protect the vulnerable people, the environment, and they all come from serious harm. This particular one I know a lot about. This is a methane explosion from an underground coal mine, and we're going to talk about that from 2020. So serious harm is different in every single one of our industries, and that's the first lesson. It's something that's usually not front of mind, but absolutely, as regulators, as risk-based regulators, it's the one thing that we need to very much deeply understand how that harm is caused, and also what are the controls that we have in place. And you'll hear me say that over and over and over again, because that is actually the secret to managing major accident risk, is deeply understanding the risks and understanding the controls and when those things are in place and effective. And so major accidents don't happen very often. And if we relied on just learning from those things, we certainly would be in a position where we would feel surprise, and everything would feel like a black swan event. We would really not have a good feel for when these events were coming. But even though major accidents themselves are complex and aren't predictable, the components of them are, because they sit in control failure. And they sit in near misses, and that's what we're going to obviously unpack today. So what are near misses? Well, they're events that had no bad outcome, but absolutely could have had a bad outcome. And they were usually either averted at the last minute by some kind of human intervention. So the humans that we usually are at the workface are the ones that prevent a lot of the really bad accidents, or the enabling conditions might not have been present. So, gas in a certain area with no ignition source is a good example of that. Or the last line of defence, the control, one of the controls that we had in place worked, and that might be some kind of emergency response control. But they're all not based on luck. They're based on controls failing and controls being weak. But in essence, the benefit for us as regulators is that they are warning signs. They are the things that we absolutely can learn from and can use to understand whether our controls are in place and effective, and then whether we're going to, how close we are to major accidents. And we're going to unpack that. Tinsley wrote a really great paper in 2011 in the Harvard Business Review talking about how every major accident and business crisis is preceded by a series of events, near misses, precursor events. And these things are easily discoverable. The challenge is, how do we make them vivid? But before we get to how we make them vivid, I want to unpack with you this concept of control reliability and just how important it is to really understanding the value of near misses. My company, a couple of years back now, completed the Brady Review, which was a review in the Queensland mining industry into the fatalities. So there'd been a series of 6 fatalities in a very short period of time. The industry was up in arms, and the Minister for Resources asked us to come in and have a look and understand what was causing the fatalities. We looked at 20 years worth of data, 47 fatalities and 35,000 incidents. And really what we wanted to understand was, how are people dying in mining? And one of the first things we did was take each of the super big investigation reports that are about 200 pages long and summarise them down each to a single fatality on a page. And they were patterns that we noticed. And these patterns, what I'm going to show you now is a causal diagram. These same patterns you see in major accidents. You see them in every industry. So whilst this is mining specific, this is very transferable. So a fatality on a page starts down in the left-hand corner. This fatality is where a worker received fatal injuries after they were thrown from a bus that they were travelling in on a surface mine site. The bus rolled over, and that's because it collided with a safety berm, and that happened because the bus driver crossed over onto the wrong side of the road. That safety berm was less than adequate. It wasn't designed to the standard that was expected. And the reason it wasn't designed to the standard is because the inspectors who should have checked it didn't check it. They didn't check it because it wasn't actually required by the safety management system, and there was no system to check, understand whether that was in place and effective. So the other component of this is that there was an extended rear design of that particular bus, and that actually catapulted that person out of the seat that they were in. And that happened, of course, because that particular worker on that bus wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And often when we think about fatalities and major accidents, it's really easy to just focus on the frontline human component of it. But as you can see, the picture that I'm painting here is that there are a number of controls that fail and come together. The worker wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The supervision was the bus driver. He was to check that, but actually in practice he had to get out of the bus every stop, walk around the bus, come back in the other side door, and only the back seats didn't have seatbelt alarms. So it was, obviously a control that was partly in place and had weakness. The driver was unable to monitor all the passengers. He would have to get in the bus and walk all the way up the back. As I said, the seatbelt alarms were not fitted to the rear seats of the bus, and that was because the risk assessments that they did when they first made these design changes didn't involve content experts. So what I'm painting here is there are a lot of things that went wrong, not just the frontline risk. And these are all controls that we all know and that were in the safety management system. So in every single fatality and major accident, it's the same picture. You always see that the controls that we think we've got in place are just not in place and effective. And that's not the big, fancy, sexy story that everybody wants to hear. It's actually the boring controls that we know about that need to be in place. And this is the secret to preventing fatalities and major accidents, is making sure those things are in place and effective. And so this was one of the biggest lessons that we found, was that fatalities occur when combinations of controls fail. Combinations. And that was not only found in our study, but also when you look at the International Council of Mining and Minerals and many other reports like this, they found the same thing. 86% of fatalities globally in mining, either the controls that we knew weren't effective, or the design of those controls was inadequate for the particular tasks. And that should give us hope, really, that we actually know how to prevent most things. It's just that the controls that need to be in place and effective. You'll hear me say that over and over. So if we go back to this causal diagram and we think about this in terms of a near miss, if we just take out this one control up here, which is the safety berm, if that was designed to standard, actually all of this is taken out, this sequence of events. And so this is the difference between and the picture of a near miss to a fatality, one control working. And this is fascinating because all we need to do is to individually understand. We don't need to be able to predict every fatality sequence. We just need to be able to know the controls, understand their performance and see whether they're in place and effective. And that's actually tougher than it seems. So whilst fatalities occur when combinations of controls fail, so do near misses, exactly the same thing, which means that all we really need to do is capture near misses, understand when those controls, which controls are in place and effective, and learn from that. So it's all about control effectiveness. And they become free lessons. Remember, there's no bad outcome with a near miss. So this is the opportunity to have no serious harm, but actually prevent the big things. And has anyone heard the concept of high reliability organisations? So high reliability organisations are organisations like airlines, they're certain parts of the medical industry, parts of explosives are classed as high reliability, and they're industries and organisations that are dynamic, they work in dynamic, really high hazard environments where if things go wrong, they go wrong very, very badly. But they manage to go decades without having major accidents. Nuclear power is another one of those. And they are fascinated with learning. They're fascinated with learning about their near misses and where their controls are not effective. So they're learning and relearning. They know they're fallible. They know their people are not going to get it right 100% of the time, even if they've got the perfect processes and have designed the perfect systems. So they see near misses as just fascinating ways of understanding where their system is not working effectively. And you might have seen the analogy of Jenga. So Jenga is just a system in itself. And when you think about Jenga, you've got all of the elements of an organisation. As you're playing the game, it's dynamic. It's changing every moment. Every time someone pulls a block out, you've got schedules, different every day, different equipment is in service, different systems are working, functioning at different levels. The workers are different, everything is different every day. And what that does is it creates holes. The system is never perfect. It's never working at 100% of its capacity. And those holes are just like controls failing. And then one day you have an incident. And what happens? You do an investigation and we blame the person who pulled the last block. And that happens over and over again. And I see, good companies putting in investigation reports and doing exactly this, almost doing it to guarding their organisations, perhaps. Really only telling you about the frontline issues when there are more systemic issues that need to be unpacked. And this is where the controls are. And so whilst organisations might be guarded around some of the big accidents that they're having, there's a lot of things that happen under legal privilege, stuff like that. The opportunity as a regulator is to draw out more near miss information and I suppose encourage that in a way where it's not linked to enforcement action. Because as regulators, from you looking down onto that Jenga set, it looks pretty much like a perfect Jenga set, and it can be really, really hard for you to see what's really going on in organisations until after the fact, until the incident. And that's where near misses help out. And so when it's going badly in an industry, all those holes are hidden. But when it's going well, all those holes are being identified. And that can really feel like bad news. So as regulators and as industries, it's really, really important that you're as fascinated with the holes and encouraging those things to be raised to you. And that makes you learning and relearning organisations as well. And so this section of the presentation has been really a context summary from my original presentation that I did in last year that Alice talked about. And I know there are some people in the room that weren't present, so hopefully that's really helpful to get an understanding of why I value near misses so much and really what they can do for your organisations to help the industry learn. So in summary, serious harm doesn't happen often. And if we waited for serious harm, it would feel like a surprise every time. But we know that there are near misses that precede every disaster, and that these near misses hold the same valuable information as what does a big disaster. And so you don't need to be able to predict that combination of all those cherries lining up. Just fix the cherries individually and encourage to understand whether the controls are in place and effective. And that really starts with, as a regulator, as a risk-based regulator, deeply knowing your risks and your controls and what they look like when they're performing effectively. And then with the ability of you to collect the near miss information, you're able to then present that back to industries in terms of where their controls are weak and help them learn. And that's what regulators in high reliability organisations do. And so there are three key challenges that I'd like to unpack. We'll unpack them with the online audience, and then we'll unpack them in detail in the workshop, and we'll really get into how you can make some of those things real in your organisation. The first challenge is actually getting the near miss reports in the first place. This sounds easy, but it's super hard. And I can see some people in the audience smiling because it is really hard. And I've worked in organisations that try really hard not to give you that information. So, we can unpack that and some of the reasons behind that. And then when is the right time and when do you take appropriate action? And we're going to look at some case studies around that from some organisations or regulators who are doing that really well. And the third challenge is, how do you make meaning of that data? Like, how do you actually use that to inform your programs, your policies, and to really drive a difference and help your industry learn? So let's unpack the first one, which is getting near miss reports from industry. Sounds simple, and here is a regulator that I would say is doing a pretty good job of this, which is the New South Wales Resources Regulator. But if you have a look at this data, this is their performance report, massive red flag, and that actually says that they've had over 2,000 notified incidents, and the number of active mines they've got is over 2,000 as well, but only 175 of those mines actually notified an incident last year, and that's consistent for them. So less than 10% of their mines are talking to them about incidents. That seems crazy, right? So just to give you an idea, some of the research around this is that in the airline industry, they would expect that 90% of near miss reports are reported, and there's good reason for that. They have dual reporting, and they come down super hard on people who, so they're aggressive watchers. If things aren't reported, it's treated very differently to something that is reported in terms of CASA. But it's more difficult when you're not in control of your work environment and in a way that everyone is, everything's not on camera, there's not a black box. So this is the reality that most of us are living in. And when we talk about why organisations don't report near misses, there's a heap of concepts that we'd like to unpack, and some of these are human. They're the human element. So normalisation of deviance is one, made popular in the Challenger explosion. But if we talk about Grosvenor Mine, which back in 2020 had probably the biggest gas explosion, and another one recently underground. 5 people came deathly close to losing their lives that day, and what you're looking at here is a pattern that was not put together until after the event, and this is all from 2016 to 2020, all of the gas exceedances, all of the times when the gas got to an unsafe level in that mine. So you look at that, and the regulator had a report for every single one of these, and actually, it looks bad looking at it now, but until you actually put this pattern together, this is something that is the value of near-miss data. But if you're not looking at it in this way, you won't be able to see that pattern in your sites and your industries as well. So only the last one of those, that little red explosion, that is the only event that actually had a bad outcome. And so what that does is it creates this proof that the mine can continue to operate safely every single time. And this is called normalisation of deviance. And it's real. And it happens not only at site level, but it also happens at a regulator level as well. It's very, very easy to slip into this, small control failures, small near misses happening. And especially if your regulators and your inspectors are from that industry and have that same expertise bias. The next point I won't reveal just yet. I just want to ask the audience here in the room, we'll just do a little test. So in comparison to all drivers on the road, I just want you to have a think, get a number in your head. How experienced do you think you are? So 1 would be you're a beginner, and 10 would be that you're highly experienced, and 5 is your average. So just have a number in your head. Okay. Who said 7 or 8? Come on, put your hands up. Yeah. Okay. Who said less? Less. Wow. Below 5. Who's below average? 4. Okay. So for the online audience, pretty much everyone's above average. And that's fairly common. It's fairly common for us to believe that we are above norm and above average. And this is called optimism bias. And it's really common, and especially with trained workforces, and especially with regulators who are experts. We always think that it's not going to happen to us, and then you've got the Aussie piece over the top of that, and we really think it's not going to happen to us. Yeah. I was just telling David, I got in yesterday, I just rode my motorbike from Darwin off-road, and he said to me, wow, how's your risk level around that? And I was like, yeah, probably should have been onto that. My optimism bias is super high about my skill level, but yeah. And so the next thing that makes it really, really hard to report near misses is risk imagination. And you guys will be dealing with this every single time you talk to an organisation. And that is, we use these risk matrices. So this is a consequence matrix. 1 is an insignificant consequence. 5 is you're having major accident or multiple fatalities. And a lot of regulators are still in the space of saying to their industries, just tell me when you have an event that could have had a high potential incident. The challenge with that is add normalisation, add optimism bias, add maybe lack of understanding about some of these really big events, especially if you've been a long time in your industry without those things happening. And it's really hard for people to have risk imagination around this stuff. And if they don't have to tell you, they won't tell you. And that is coming from experience. And the other thing that happens quite a lot, which if you look at the Coal Mine Board of Inquiry, the actual outcome is usually what people feed into these risk matrices, not what could have happened. So they see near misses as success rather than as failure. So asking people to imagine the worst case with inadequate tools just gives you, as regulators, not a very good outcome. You're not going to, if that's all you're asking for in your regulations is tell us when you've had a high potential incident, and you're not specifying those events specifically, people are probably not going to tell you about them. So they're effectively useless. And the last thing would be there are a number of other reasons within organisations why people withhold information, and that's to do with the time they've got available, the amount of paperwork, the reputation, and maybe they're thinking about liability. And so there are things that regulators do that potentially stifle near-miss reporting as well. The first one of those is regulators who give attention to the really high frequency events. So if these might be your medically treated issues or your first aid injuries or things that you're seeing a lot of, it's really easy when that's happening, or LTIs. Those things are very different and have very different causes to the major accident risks. And so if your inspectors are spending a lot of time focusing on those kind of things at site, then that's what people feel like you think is important. There is, in some industries, a perception that that a regulator would collect evidence to use against them. I'm dealing with this with a couple of companies at the moment, and it's very real, like it or not. It's something that, as regulators, building that trust and overcoming that is super important. And also when we respond in ways that are seen as punishment. And so unnecessarily putting enforcement notices on people who have proactively reported. So remember the New South Wales data where 7%, only 7% of their mines are reporting near misses or incidents to them. So if you think about that, I wonder are you collecting that data yourself, and do you think that is happening in your industry, and then why would that be happening? Having a reporting system that is difficult to use, clunky, people who only have one login in the organisation, then that person leaves. There's all sorts of reasons why it gets really difficult to give you information. So thinking about how user-friendly your systems are to enter data. How many fields do people have to enter? Are they entering fields that you don't even use? That kind of stuff can be really, really important. And also, when the information is given to a regulator, but they don't use it to give feedback and to value to the industry. So, if that's happening and you're not helping the industry learn with the data, then of course it's going to be seen as evidence to collect against them, that kind of stuff. So, unfortunately, it's a bit of a cycle. Some of the regulator best practices that we see really specifying the types of near misses that you want reported. And so these are lists, really deeply understanding, if you deeply understand each of the types of fatality and major accident risks or business crisis risks that you want to manage, those scenarios, and understand what the controls look like when they're failing, it's really quite easy to write a list of the near-miss events, and you'll see those near misses. They're the precursors to fatalities. And some of the other best practices we're going to talk about is sharing learnings back to the industry, so storytelling failure. The organisations that are doing this best, the regulators that are doing this best, certainly are using bow tie risk assessments and having an understanding of their most important controls and getting down to performance standard level for each of those, because then you've got an objective assessment against each of your big risks, what those controls look like when they're in place and effective. And dual reporting, I talked about that before. So if you're in a situation where you've got a train driver and a control, or air traffic control and a pilot, you can get dual reporting, which means if two people don't report, then you've got almost two opportunities, and one is kind of backing the other. Difficult. I mean, I suppose you can do the same with a nurse-doctor arrangement in some respects, and maybe you do, and I'd be interested to flesh that out in the workshop this afternoon. So let's just talk about the first two, specifying the near misses you want reported in your regulations or in guidance notes, and also sharing learnings back to the industry. I do want to start with sentinel events in hospitals as maybe an example that could do with some improvement. I'm obviously pretty used to giving bad news, so yeah. So the sentinel events, if you look at all those sentinel events, they're all actual serious harm events. There's only one in there that is to do with near misses, and that's number 9, which is discharge or release of an infant or a child to an authorised person. Everything else in there has already had the serious harm. So we're only learning from events that have had bad outcomes. There are so many more to learn from. And it's potential that is important. So remember, for every single one of these sentinel events, there's a heap of near-miss data that is sitting behind it that you can learn from and improve the control effectiveness. And then there's this kind of scenario. So you saw the ammonium nitrate truck, the Laverton WA one that I put up before. That event, there's actually a series of events in Australia where ammonium nitrate trucks have exploded, one on the Bruce Highway a couple of weeks ago. When I went looking for the data to see where the near-miss data is around brake failures and failures at a level, especially around AN trucks and things carrying dangerous goods, it's not kept. So how are the industries learning? You know, we can continue to do individual investigations and we can wait for massive failure, or we can learn from the near-miss events. Here's an example of good practice. So near misses in the air industry. If you read this list, these are all potential harm events. Nothing has gone wrong. Where you've got a multiple malfunction of an aircraft that has affected the operation, still no bad outcome. It's not about the crash, it's about the malfunction. Where you've had an incapacitation of a flight crew member, where the fuel content has been wrong. All those things they're issues and they're bad, but nothing bad has happened. So we're not waiting for the bad outcome. We're actually identifying what the precursor events are and the control weaknesses and asking people to report those things because they're the ones we want to learn from before the bad outcome. And you see the same thing in rail. Rail's probably got a better example and we'll discuss that in the workshop. And I just want to move on now to storytelling because, as I keep saying, bad events don't happen very often. And what we really want is to, as regulators, is to help the industry learn. So if it happens at one site, we can tell that story right across the industry and everybody can learn from it. And so there's 2 things in a good story that need to be included. The first one is the emotional connection. So emotional connection in this case, I'm not particularly asking regulators to make things soppy, but I'm asking you to link it to the risk. And that is so rare. Like I love reading alerts that come out of regulators, and I sometimes write back to regulators and say, hey, it's, you know, you've written this, but actually no one understands what could happen, what the bad outcome could be. And also talking about the control failure, like so really then getting into the detail around what can an industry learn from this. Those 2 things are super important in every single near miss. So you have to make the connection to the risk and then discuss the detail. What is it that they can learn from it, the industry? Otherwise, don't collect the data. It's not really worthwhile. Here's a poor example. This is where a bypass had been placed on a system preventing the machine from shutting down. This regulator could use pictures. They could explain what could have happened and linked it to the risk. And also, you know, what's most interesting when someone bypasses a system or when there's a human factor issue is not that they did it, but actually why they did it. That's where you get into the human factors piece, and that's what people need to learn, and that's how they need to improve their systems and build error tolerance into their systems. So every near miss, this is a great near miss, and there is so much more learning that can come out of it, and this is what I really, really encourage you guys to do when you do get near misses, because once you start to do this well, people will be happy to report more to you. This is one poster, but it's broken up into 2. This is Safer Together and how they do industry sharing. So for every near miss, they do one of these little learning things, and they talk about what happened. They talk about why it happened, and what people can learn. And then they also have prompting questions at the bottom to ask yourself and your crew around what can we learn from this. How do you make it real for the work crew? And there's no reason why every regulator can't put information together like this. So that is all about the first point around getting more reports. Now, when to take appropriate action, and we're going to discuss this more in the workshop this afternoon, but we all have response compliance models. We've all probably got something written in our organisation that helps us know how to respond. And, it's appropriate to respond differently in different situations. But if you think about this from a human perspective and a psychological perspective, and you're trying to get more near-miss reports, I'm not talking about the really bad outcomes where things, are moving into the criminal system. This is a study done by the New South Wales Resources Regulator on basically all their incidents. They looked at from a human and organisational factors perspective, and they found that of all their incidents, nearly 3/4 of them were all errors. So it's not like people were non-compliant anyway. They were trying to do the right thing. Something had happened. They'd zigged instead of zagged. The control wasn't exactly what they thought. And then nearly the other quarter are all routine non-compliances. So they're cultural issues that are happening within the organisation. And this is really, really important, because if we start to put notices on sites and discipline them for things where actually when you dig into the data, the human factors is to do with errors, then organisations will close down and they won't learn from their near misses. And nearly all of these are near misses. And so that creates what's called a cycle of blame. The cycle of blame is, it can come out of notices, it can come out of all sorts of things. And I'm not asking you not to give notices. I'm asking you, when it's near misses, to how do you think about that in a different way? So when we blame, and when an organisation blames, because it'll get passed down. I know I'm using the word blame, but think about it just in terms of any enforcement action, administrative action, that kind of stuff. It breeds a fear to share more bad news with the regulator, and that leads to cover-ups, and that leads to a lack of information flow. And that means that you guys don't get the information you need about where the controls are not effective in your industries. You've got to go and audit and find it yourself, and that takes additional resources, and you don't really have the inside information from each of those particular organisations. And that leads to no improvement. And then you get the same errors and violations and the same control failures. And so you're back in this cycle. And this cycle specifically applies to all incidents, but what I'm talking about here and what I would ask you to reflect on is near misses, where nothing bad actually did happen. Yeah. And I would say one of the best practices that has come out of any regulator is CASA, taking on a just culture approach. This is a really brave thing to do, and they've recently put out their first directive, which is extends just culture protections. So they say that they won't put administrative action, issue an enforcement notice, or do criminal prosecutions for any organisation or person that comes forward with information, with a report, even where they've contravened the regulatory requirements. This is all in the name of learning. This is all in the name of getting the real information. And that's super brave, but they know that is what you actually have to do to get people to speak up honestly about where their systems are fallible. And there are exceptions, of course. So gross, willful, deliberate contravention of legislation, situations that involve serious and imminent risk to air safety, and where there's been repeat events as well. So, I mean, there are it still takes into account where you've got multiple. So there are obviously exceptions, and really this is, there's the people who are willful and negligent and or multiple issues happening. There's still opportunity in this directive for that. This directive is available on their website as well, so you can get it and have a look at the detail behind it too. But it's very forward-thinking. And the last point and the challenge, I suppose, for regulators is making meaning of near-miss data. So once you actually do get it, which is really what the first 2 points are about, if you've overcome all of those hurdles and you're getting reports through, then what do you actually do with that data? So remembering that near misses are warning signs, they're opportunities to see the controls failing. The challenge is that often the boffins who can collect this information and know how to work those funny Power BIs and the graphs and all of that kind of stuff are different to the people who have the knowledge and the data, knowledge and the expertise. So one of the best things you can do as a regulator is link your experts, your on-the-ground inspectors with the data intelligence teams, and make sure you give them the good equipment as well. So Toyota, for example, here's an example of where Toyota have used a deviation. So they're taking the trends. They're taking the trends of just one. So they're having customer complaints here to do with speed controls of the pedals. And they've got this baseline that they've established, and in this particular case it's nice and easy. You can see a deviation. There's a couple of deaths in there as well, but there is a high level of deviation in terms of the number of complaints. That's super easy when you're looking at it like that, but what's really, really important here is breaking down the data to a control or a risk perspective, because every single risk, there's no use just saying I've had 50 near-miss reports come in as a regulator. That's actually only a good measure of reporting culture. It's not going to tell you about which risks are uncontrolled, which controls need work and need education on. So you need to break it down to individual risk. And that comes out of a study out of the Netherlands, Linda Bellamy. She talks about the smallest severity frequent accidents can provide information about the direct and underlying causes of bigger severity events, but only if you're looking in the same hazard category. It's super important. You can look at her study and see that if you're looking at, so for example, falls from heights of scaffolds, the deaths, 1 death, 6 permanent injuries, 26 recoverable injuries. So there's a pattern there, and that's because the causes are the same, the controls are the same. So the smaller events can tell you information about the bigger ones. The petroleum industry has taken this on. It's called API 754. And it says that at the top there, you've got your big events of high consequence. Obviously, they don't happen very often though. And then you've got events of lesser consequence. And if you think about the data sources that you've got available to you, you've got audits, inspections, regulatory intelligence. You've maybe got near misses, and you've certainly got incident reports that are coming in. All of that data together, pool it together, and then cut it by risk. That is the difference between how I see most regulators doing it and what actually is valuable. So you'll learn about your control failures if you think about that from an individual hazard perspective or risk perspective. And so what that looks like on an API 754 triangle is you by a single risk. So let's just say medication errors. You get all your audits, inspections and intelligence around that, and you add that to your near-miss data, and you add it to your harm data, and you start to get a pattern. You can see things you couldn't see before around your individual ability to manage that risk. So consider each risk separately, do individual analysis for each of these. And so in summary, what could or should a regulator do with near-miss reports? Well, the first thing I would say is if you're going to do one thing, story tell the stuff you're getting already back to your industry. Give them back information on what could have happened and what you've learnt from it about the control failures. Analyse for the patterns and the trends, but do it by single risk. And then use that information to support targeted education around how controls fail. You'll see that there are multiple control failures, and give that information back to your industry in detail. Targeted programs and focus. So as a regulator, you can't focus on everything. If you want to be a risk-based regulator, choose small projects, just like Malcolm Sparrow says, and focus on improving individual things. Use your near-miss data to inform which things you work on. And inform your policy decisions based on this near-miss data set. So you don't have to wait for the big events, just focus on the near-misses. And all of this is really aimed at helping an industry learn and improving your serious harm. Thank you very much.
I'm going to check in with Lorraine and see how much time we've got for questions. We've only got 5 minutes, and I'm seeing a lot of applause online as well. Thank you very much. What I'm not seeing online is a whole lot of questions. So anyone online, if you've got that burning question that you want to ask, those of us in the room are actually a bit hampered because we can't get on Zoom. So this is all about you guys online. Please do pop your questions in now. I've certainly got one that I would like to start off with, privilege of being the facilitator. Jodi, often as regulators, the near misses are non-compliances themselves. And if we don't take action on those non-compliances, we can really be perceived as being a weak regulator. Have you got any comments to make on this little conundrum?
Yeah, it's a super big conundrum, and it's really uncomfortable, isn't it, to not act when a near miss comes in if there has been a non-compliance. And I think you need to take the lead of CASA. CASA are saying that even they give protections, even if a report comes in and it's voluntary, if it's a near miss and even if there's a non-compliance and it's against the regulations and it's very clear, they still will not take action unless it's reckless, or unless what was the other things? There were 3 years repeat events. That's super uncomfortable, but that's what excellent risk-based regulators are thinking about, because they're weighing up learning versus compliance and recognising that if they want to be risk-based, they actually have to sometimes let things go to learn.
So to be risk-based, we really need to take some risks. There are some questions coming through online now. Have you got any thoughts on using near-miss reporting internally to prevent regulatory failure? Should we be looking at our own near-misses as regulators?
Do you want to expand on that, Alice? What do you think? Give me an example.
I'm going to make some vast assumptions here based on the one sentence of question there from Immigration New Zealand. Thank you very much for that one. But I think often, we make mistakes as regulators as well. Sometimes we're human, we're not perfect. We do things that aren't quite aligned with our own controls as regulators and the things that we have in place to make sure we're regulating well. Should we be turning this framework on ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you start to unpack control failure and whether the controls are in place and effective, you will find gaps in your own system around how you're capturing that data. I did have a conversation with a security regulator, a national security regulator, I won't be specific about the industry, who said that they actually had realised that they weren't capturing data and that was a big finding for them. So, and reflection. Oh my goodness. And obviously looking after your own people is important as looking after the organisations and industries that you regulate as well.
What about if a regulator doesn't have a practice around near-miss reporting at this point in time? Where should we start?
I would start by doing a review of the big events that do happen, and you can start, if you wanted to start straight away, with a brainstorm of what are the big risk scenarios, the big material risk scenarios that could happen that you feel like you are there, what your purpose is as a regulator to protect against, and start to understand what the key controls are and what the near-miss scenarios might be associated with those. So the structured way to do that would be to use a bow tie risk assessment process, and we're going to go through that in the afternoon. But, that is really where you want to start. There will be near-miss events that are really specific, and start writing guidance and asking for that information. And then as soon as you get one near-miss report, share that back to the industry and celebrate it, and just continue to do that. So it's like a snowball effect. And, the next practice would be to try and build that into your regulations wherever you can.
Yeah, I think not a question, but perhaps a comment on the culture of us as regulators. I think there's something we can learn about that storytelling. It's can be very uncomfortable for us to put ourselves out there and go, this is what would have happened, because we're speculating then, where we haven't got the facts to base it on. The facts are that nothing happened. So then to put an opinion out there and say, well, there but for the grace of whichever higher deity you care to pray to, it would have been a big incident. That can, uncomfortable is a word that I would use there. So I think that is a cultural thing. Perhaps do you have any comments on other sort of cultures of regulators or cultures of industries that you've seen that can enhance or hamper near-miss reporting?
I think that there is sometimes a fear of regulators when the information's coming to you that maybe you're not doing enough with it, and that's an internal fear. And that, I suppose, what do we call it? The guilty knowledge. So once you start to get information and it's coming in, are you doing enough with it? Are you, and does that mean that you're liable or you're going to be held up, in some light if something does go wrong? And, have a look at what happened in Queensland mining. That did happen. The regulator did come under the spotlight, but it's not about it. As long as you're doing something with the information and sharing it back and encouraging your industry to be better and doing it in a way that's very structured and educational, it's enough. It is enough. And I think the only time is when you're capturing data and it's sitting in notebooks, for example, inspector notebooks, and not being collated in a way that it can be used to see patterns and to drive trends. And so if you're a company, if you're an organisation that's still using Lotus Notes, for example, everything's very siloed in Lotus Notes, and it is very hard to get that information out and put it into patterns. So this is, if you want to start to get near misinformation, really need to make sure you're using it back to the industry.
I think there's nothing like a Royal Commission for some great storytelling sometimes. But I think that's all we've got time for today. I'd really like to thank the online audience for joining us, and our in-person audience as well, and there's more to come for those of us who are here in person. As anyone who is a regular participant of an NRCoP webinar will know, you will receive an evaluation survey in your inbox shortly. Please do take the time to fill that in. As a committee, we do look at that feedback regularly, and it's really important for helping us to come up with our next events. There's also a reminder that enrolments are open for the Professional Regulator Professional Development Program that is built by members of the NRCoP in collaboration with RegNet at the ANU, at the Australian National University. I mean, there are people in the room today who had direct involvement in developing that course and who have done it themselves and can, by all accounts, provide a ringing endorsement of it. So check out the ANZOG website for further details on that. Our next NRCoP National Hybrid event is on Australia's integrity landscape, learning from the past and preparing for the future.